Jon was only an infant when he first arrived in King's Landing. He had no memory of wind-swept battlements or the cold halls of Winterfell, nor the quiet hush of the Godswood. He would grow to hear stories of the North and the solemn men who kept their vows there, but the Red Keep was all he truly knew. Robert Baratheon, newly crowned king of the Seven Kingdoms, took the child under his guardianship partly out of obligation to his fallen friend Ned Stark, though the nature of that obligation was one of those things no one dared speak of openly in the glittering corridors of the royal castle. In public, the boy was acknowledged merely as the Snow Boy, a bastard from the north, an unspoken kindness from the king to House Stark. Yet in private, Robert looked upon the boy with a conflicted mixture of fondness and resentment he could never quite articulate. It was obvious from the beginning that this child was important. The way Ned Stark had clung to him so protectively, the way Robert's advisors advised caution, the way Queen Cersei's lips pursed whenever the child's name was mentioned. But Robert Baratheon was king, and if he wished to keep the boy in King's Landing, no one could gainsay him. Jon grew up in the shadow of the Iron Throne. Not that he knew what it all meant at first. His earliest memories were of stone walls and torchlit corridors, of the hush that fell over the servants in the Red Keep's halls whenever they saw him toddling along, wearing hand-me-down clothes and trailing behind one of the castle's maids. They were never unkind to him, not directly. At first, he was too young to notice the wide-eyed stares, the whispers, the speculations on why King Robert cared so deeply for a northern boy of uncertain parentage. He remembered once, at around the age of 4, tugging on the hem of King Robert's cloak as the king stood in the training yard. Jon had been entranced by the swirl of the cloak's velvet, the golden stags embroidered on it. He had no understanding of the significance of such heraldry, only that King Robert was big and loud and, on occasion, ruffled his hair in a gentle manner that caused the boy to squeal with delight. Cersei Lannister watched all this from a distance. She observed the boy's big gray eyes, the dark hair that marked him as a Stark, and she felt not just distaste, but suspicion. She had deduced early on that this must be Eddard Stark's get. The official story was that the boy was a nameless Snow, a baseborn child, and that Ned Stark, who had returned north after Robert was firmly seated on the throne, had entrusted the boy to Robert's care, as a sign of their continued bond from the days of the rebellion. That story, while accepted publicly, never truly satisfied her. She was too clever, too cunning, to believe that Ned Stark would have parted with his bastard so easily. The entire matter reeked of secrets. But King Robert had barked at her once, to let the boy be, and so she spoke no more of it, other than to grimace whenever the child was mentioned. As Jon grew, he had no illusions about who he was. The Red Keep was a dangerous place for illusions. He was a ward of the king, though never officially declared so, and a boy with no name but Snow. The courtiers, perhaps to earn favor with Robert, were mostly careful in front of him. But he heard enough scraps to know he was no true lordling, no precious member of the royal family. Despite this, he had a bedchamber near the old tower, modestly furnished but more comfortable than any room he might have occupied in a lesser holdfast. Robert saw to that. Jon's nursemaids changed every few moons. Some said it was the queen's doing, to avoid any sense of closeness or consistency for the boy. Yet whether from the king's direct orders or the underlying decency of the staff, Jon was never neglected. Perhaps not loved like a prince, but never starved or beaten. And there were moments, however fleeting, when Robert would swoop down and scoop Jon onto his knee, the smell of ale on his breath, and call the boy lad or my cub, tousling his unruly black hair in that large meaty hand. In those moments, Jon felt a strange warmth blossom inside him, a child's hope that maybe, just maybe, he was not as alone as he sometimes felt. He spent his earliest years trailing in the footsteps of the Red Keep's household. The master-at-arms, a gruff man named Ser Aaron Santagar, taught all the young pages and squires the rudiments of swordsmanship, how to hold a practiced blade, how to move one's feet. Jon was not quite a page. He had no official status that demanded it, yet Robert insisted he receive the same martial training as the others. The day Jon first stepped into the training yard, wooden sword in hand, he noticed the sunlight glinting off the gilded plates of the royal guards posted along the edges. He also noticed Prince Joffrey, around his own age, sneering at him from a corner. That sneer was the first hint of the trouble that would come from the golden-haired prince. Joffrey had been told many times, and by many lips, that he was the heir to the throne, the golden boy in whom all the future of the realm was vested. Jon had no such illusions or sense of self-importance, but children do not need adult cynicism to sense hostility. He could see in Joffrey's posture, the tilt of his chin, the clench of his small fists, that the prince hated him even before Jon said a single word. Joffrey was petty with the other pages, but to Jon he was downright cruel. Whenever the master-at-arms set the boys to practicing, Joffrey would make a show of laughing or calling Jon names. The king's mongrel was one favorite. Jon tried to ignore him, focusing instead on his footwork and the advice from Ser Aaron. But children cannot ignore taunts forever. One day, after a sharp hit to Jon's side that had been accompanied by Joffrey's mocking grin, Jon lost his temper and shoved the prince. The training yard fell silent. Joffrey's eyes went wide for an instant, as though he couldn't believe he'd been manhandled by a bastard. Then he snarled and swung his wooden sword at Jon's face. Jon blocked the blow on pure instinct, though the impact numbed his forearm. Ser Aaron quickly separated them, scolding them both, but Joffrey was not finished. He ranted and raved about how no lowborn boy should dare lay hands on a prince, how the king's mongrel should be lashed. Jon braced himself for a punishment, but the next day Robert himself arrived in the yard, booming with laughter. He asked for the story, then clapped Jon on the shoulder and told the boy, "You've spirit, I'll give you that." He glanced at Joffrey with a disapproving frown, told him to hold his temper better. From that moment, the tension between Jon and Joffrey only grew, but Jon's sense of gratitude to Robert deepened. Even if the king was an indulgent, boisterous, and inconsistent father figure, he was the only father figure Jon had. For better or worse, life in the Red Keep introduced Jon to an intricate web of courtiers, knights, and ladies who constantly whispered among themselves. Servants gossiped as they cleaned the corridors, lesser lords schemed in alcoves, and foreign dignitaries brought news of conflict beyond the city walls. He learned to navigate around them quietly, a habit from his earliest days, listening more than he spoke, absorbing the tidbits of conversation that floated through the air. He heard about the starving peasants in Flea Bottom, the Iron Fleet in the west, the possible Targaryen heirs rumored to be across the Narrow Sea. On more personal matters, he also heard the whispers about himself, that he had the look of a Stark, that he might be a threat to the Queen's children, that perhaps Ned Stark had left him as a subtle reminder of the North's loyalty, or for even darker reasons. The talk never ended, and the older Jon got, the more he realized his presence in the Red Keep was no small matter. He was a living question mark that some people wanted answered. On his 7th name day, Robert gifted him a pony. It was a thoughtful gesture in some ways, but there was a shadow in the king's eyes, a weight when he looked at Jon. Perhaps Robert had just come from another fight with the Queen, or perhaps he'd been haunted by the memory of another dark-haired child, one who might have existed if things had gone differently between him and Lyanna Stark. Jon knew none of this. He only sensed that Robert's brow was furrowed, his voice gruffer than usual, as he stood at the edge of the stables and said, "Here, lad, take good care of this beast. A boy should learn to ride." Jon beamed and thanked him politely, remembering the lessons Ser Aaron had drilled into him. Show courtesy in all things, even when you might not receive it in return. Robert ruffled Jon's hair, then walked off with a slump to his shoulders, lost in his own regrets. Jon devoted much of his time to training. With the occasional push from the king or Ser Aaron, he was permitted to practice archery, swordplay, and horseback riding as rigorously as any page or squire. He began to show talent with a blade. Slender and quick on his feet, he had the advantage of that stark broodiness, that quiet approach that made it easy for him to keep his focus. He took to archery less naturally, but with enough diligence he could manage a fair shot. In those early years, there was a constant sense of competition in the training yard, especially whenever Joffrey was about. The prince had grown resentful of the fact that Jon, a bastard, could match or outdo him with the sword. Joffrey's own temper and vanity hampered him more than his actual skill. He cared more about winning in a flashy manner and posturing for the onlookers than about truly learning the crafts of war. Jon, on the other hand, tried to keep his head down and learn from his mistakes. He bruised easily, but what bruises he got taught him how to better defend next time. And so it went, day after day, under the watchful eye of the castle's knights and the watchful ear of the castle's spies. For King's Landing was full of spies, Varys the spider foremost among them. Jon had seen the man skitter about the corridors with that obsequious smile, that soft voice that could turn chilling when one paid close attention. Varys occasionally addressed Jon with little pleasantries. "Young Master Snow, my, how you've grown," but never lingered long. Over time, Jon grew wary of him, sensing that Varys kept an eye on everything and everyone, especially the boy who was a curious footnote to the court. When Jon was around 8 or 9, Varys began speaking to him more openly, though always in that gentle, simpering tone. The spymaster would say things like, "We must care for the good of the realm, young Snow, and sometimes the realm needs strong men to keep the peace. We shall see what part you might play in these games." Then he would vanish down a corridor or slip behind a tapestry, leaving Jon puzzled and uneasy. He came to realize that, in King's Landing, no one said exactly what they meant, save perhaps the king after too much wine. Everyone spoke in hints and half-truths. Jon learned to do the same, especially as he grew older and recognized that knowledge was power. He stored away the small bits he gleaned, uncertain of their meaning, but convinced that one day they might matter. There were a few who treated Jon kindly, even warmly. Ser Barristan Selmy, for instance, never looked at Jon with scorn. The Lord Commander of the Kingsguard was always courteous, nodding when Jon offered a greeting, occasionally giving him tips on sword stance or reminding him to keep his shield up. Ser Barristan had served the crown for decades, had seen war, seen kings come and go, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity that Jon admired. Another was Myrcella Baratheon, Joffrey's younger sister, who did not share Joffrey's cruelty. Myrcella once approached Jon in the castle library when they were both around 10. She shyly asked if he had read about Nymeria's voyage yet. Jon had not, so Myrcella offered to show him the book that detailed the Rhoynish princess's journey to Dorne. She had a sweet smile, and in that moment, Jon realized that not all Lannisters or Baratheons or royals were like Joffrey. When they parted ways, Myrcella gave him a quick curtsy, giggling at the impropriety of showing courtesy to a bastard. Still, the small kindness warmed him. Occasionally, Eddard Stark would journey south to King's Landing on matters of state, especially in the early years of Robert's reign. On those visits, Jon felt a strange mixture of longing and apprehension. For all that Jon had heard rumors that Ned Stark was his father, he'd never dared to ask the man directly. He saw the sorrow in Ned's eyes whenever they stood close. Ned would quietly ask Jon about his lessons, about how the king treated him, about what the boy wanted. Jon never found the words to express the swirling feelings inside him. In truth, he looked to Ned with a yearning that confused him. Was Ned a father? An uncle? A guardian from afar? Why did Ned never press to bring Jon north? Why leave him in this viper's nest of a city? Yet the older Jon got, the more he recognized that Ned was protecting him somehow. The reasons were beyond him. Something to do with Robert's wrath and the Targaryens, rumors that had never fully died. But seeing Ned was a reminder that Jon had ties to House Stark, and that there was more to him than the label bastard. Cersei, for her part, loathed those visits from Ned. She would watch from atop a balcony as the stoic northern lord exchanged words with Jon in the courtyard. If she happened to pass them in a hallway, her eyes flicked between Ned and Jon with a cold glint that spoke of mistrust. It was only Robert's presence that prevented her from ordering Jon away or exiled to some remote fortress. Yet she did not have to be overt about her malice. In a place like King's Landing, the Queen's faintest disapproval was enough to bring subtle cruelty down on Jon from other corners of the court. If a guard favored the Queen over the King, he might deny Jon access to certain areas or treat him roughly when no one else was looking. If a minor lord wanted to curry favor with the Queen, he might mock Jon at a feast or goad his sons into challenging him to humiliating contests. These small slights piled upon Jon's shoulders, but he learned to endure them. Over time, his endurance became a shield in itself, a way to weather each new insult. In the evenings, when the halls turned quiet except for the patrolling guards and the occasional whisper of scurrying rats, Jon often slipped out of his chamber to explore. He learned the ways of the Red Keep, which stairwells were seldom used, which passageways led to the lower levels. Sometimes he found himself creeping near the dungeons, hearing the faint groans of prisoners or the dripping of water through cracks in the walls. He never lingered down there long, spooked by the gloom and the stories of what Mad King Aerys had done in those vaults. Other times, he crept toward the rooftop walkways that afforded views of the city, the labyrinth of streets lit by moonlight. The wind would whip through his hair, reminding him of a north he'd never truly known. On those nights, he felt a pull inside his chest, as though part of him belonged somewhere else entirely. But he was a child of King's Landing, with no path to the north, so he turned away from the vistas and returned to the castle's interior, letting the hush of the corridors lull him into a solitary comfort. When Jon turned 12, King Robert decided it was time for him to hunt. He took the boy on a royal hunt outside the city walls, deep into the Kingswood, accompanied by a retinue of knights and hounds. Robert reveled in hunts. It was one of the few times the king seemed truly content, aside from drinking or carousing. The forest rang with the baying of hounds and the calls of huntsmen. Jon's heart raced with excitement and apprehension. He rode behind the king, perched on a mare bigger than his old pony. The huntsmen flushed out boar and deer, and Robert himself led the chase, roaring and laughing. Eventually, they cornered a boar, and Robert demanded that Jon try his hand at spearing the beast. Nervous but determined, Jon dismounted, took the boar spear in shaking hands, and advanced. The boar charged. Robert stood behind Jon, ready to intervene, yet also determined to let the boy face this challenge. Jon braced the spears but against the ground, just as he'd been taught, and the boar impaled itself, kicked and thrashed, nearly knocking Jon off his feet. But in the end, the boar collapsed. The huntsman cheered. Robert clapped Jon on the back with such force that Jon stumbled. The king was beaming. "Well done, lad," he bellowed. In that moment, Jon felt a surge of pride. His arms were trembling, adrenaline still coursed through his veins, but he'd proven something, to himself, to the king, perhaps even to the onlookers. That night in camp, Robert told him war stories, half of them slurred by strong wine, but Jon listened intently. He saw a flicker of fatherly pride in the king's eyes. It was fleeting, but for once, Robert seemed content to have Jon in his company. After that hunt, Jon's status at court changed slightly. He was still a Snow, a bastard of uncertain parentage, but the king's open praise at the hunt had made an impression on the knights and lords. Some began to treat Jon with more respect, albeit begrudgingly in some cases. Even Joffrey, though he sneered and called Jon savage behind his back, seemed less eager to cross swords with him in the training yard. The queen, however, grew more frigid. She would watch Jon at feasts or gatherings from across the hall. Her expression shuddered. But she did little overtly against him. Robert's approval acted like a shield, for now. Meanwhile, Jon immersed himself more deeply in training, determined not to squander the king's praise. He honed his swordsmanship, practiced archery until his fingers bled, and learned horsemanship from the stable master. Nights found him exhausted, but he embraced the exhaustion. It was better than lying awake, haunted by questions about who he truly was. The older he became, the more Jon found ways to slip into the library. He had discovered a passion for reading histories and tales of adventure, a side effect, perhaps, of spending his earliest years hearing snatches of stories about the realm. The library in the Red Keep was well stocked, though overshadowed by the Great Library in Old Town. There Jon devoured accounts of the Targaryen conquest, the uprisings of the Faith Militant, the Dance of the Dragons. He pored over genealogies, although he felt a pang each time he read about the great houses and their lineages, so sure of their ancestry. No genealogies mention House Snow, of course. His reading served another purpose, too. Knowledge could be a weapon in a place like King's Landing. He noticed that certain scrolls went missing from time to time, likely whisked away by unscrupulous courtiers or spies like Varys or Littlefinger. Jon learned to keep quiet about what he read, to let no one realize how much he was absorbing. If no one expected a bastard to care about the realm's past or the realm's politics, that was to Jon's advantage. By the time Jon reached 14, the rumors of Targaryens across the sea became louder among the court. Viserys Targaryen, said some, was amassing funds in Essos, hoping to sail to Westeros and reclaim the Iron Throne. Others whispered that he had married his sister to a Dothraki horselord, hoping for a horde to sweep across the narrow sea. King Robert grew more restless, more agitated by any mention of Targaryens. One night, Jon, now tall and wiry, still with the solemn gray eyes, found the king in his cups, brooding by a fireplace. Robert beckoned Jon closer. He mumbled something about Targaryens being the scourge of the realm, vile dragonspawn that needed to be stamped out. "Your father helped me slay that lot," he said, voice slurring. "He was my brother in arms, Ned Stark. The Targaryens stole Lyanna from me. Never forget that, boy." Jon stood silently, uncertain how to respond. Robert eventually shoved a cup of wine into Jon's hand, instructing him to drink, which Jon did so awkwardly, the bitter taste scorching his throat. He recognized in Robert's words a deeper bitterness. Jon had heard that the king had once loved Lyanna Stark, that her death had spurred Robert's rebellion. But he had never connected the dots to himself, not fully. He left the king that night with a heavy feeling in his chest, as though the mention of Lyanna was a piece of a puzzle he couldn't quite fit together. Meanwhile, tension at court escalated. Word arrived that Beric Dondarrion had set off after raiders in the Riverlands. Whispers spread about the Hound's brutality, about the Mountain's atrocities. The realm was a tinderbox waiting for a spark, and Jon felt the undercurrents swirling. The Queen's father, Tywin Lannister, held the real power in the west. Stannis Baratheon brooded on Dragonstone, while Renly Baratheon tried to gather allies in the south. None of this was lost on Jon, who watched as courtiers bowed and scraped in the presence of the king but openly plotted behind his back. Robert, for his part, seemed half blind to the duplicity around him, more concerned with feasts, hunts, and whoring. Yet on occasion, Jon would see the king's temper flare in council meetings, a reminder of the man who had once swung his warhammer in battle and shattered Rhaegar Targaryen upon the trident. There was power in him still, but it was a smoldering ember buried under layers of indulgence and regret. Joffrey, who was near Jon's age, was now a spoiled princeling, prone to sadistic games and petty cruelties. He enjoyed tormenting animals, lesser nobles, and especially those whom he deemed beneath him. Jon, having grown taller and stronger, did not fear Joffrey physically, but he was wary of crossing him publicly. Joffrey wore the crown prince's title like a cloak, and the king's complacency emboldened the boy. The two rarely had direct conflicts anymore, though. Joffrey preferred to snipe at Jon with barbed insults about bastardy or about the Starks, while Jon learned to return a measured sneer or a quiet retort. On a few occasions, Myrcella or Tommen would intervene, drawing Joffrey's attention away. Tommen was a sweet, shy boy who looked up to knights and heroes. Myrcella had grown into a clever, gentle young lady. Neither showed any of Joffrey's viciousness, much to Jon's relief. Once, in a corridor, he heard Myrcella scolding Joffrey for mocking Jon's parentage. Joffrey dismissed her with a sneer, but Tommen appeared to agree with Myrcella, nodding shyly. It gave Jon a small flicker of hope that not all of House Baratheon Lannister would stand against him if trouble arose, though trouble seemed inevitable. At 15, Jon had grown into a handsome youth, with the dark hair and long face that marked him as a Stark by blood, though his name was still Snow and he had no official title or prospects. Men-at-arms nodded respectfully to him now. Some even called him my lord, though ironically or out of caution. Servants whispered about whether the king might legitimize him, might name him a Storm or a Rivers or a proper name of some sort. Still, Jon harbored no illusions that Robert would do such a thing, not with the Queen's hostility and with Joffrey poised as heir. Yet part of Jon longed for some recognition, some sign that he was more than a stray pup from the north. He also dreamed, in idle moments, of the day he might journey to Winterfell, to see the seat of House Stark, to meet the rest of Ned Stark's children. He had heard there were many: Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, Rickon. He imagined them as a brood of wolves, living in the cold and singing the songs of the old gods. But so far, that was all it remained, a fantasy. One morning, not long after Jon's 15th name day, the entire castle erupted in news. Eddard Stark was coming to King's Landing to serve as Hand of the King, replacing the recently deceased Jon Arryn. The rumors spread like wildfire. Jon Arryn had died under strange circumstances, and Robert, in need of a trustworthy hand, had summoned Ned Stark from the north. This news sent a jolt through Jon. Ned Stark here permanently? That would change everything. Jon could hardly contain his curiosity. Why had the old hand died? Why had Robert chosen Ned? And what would Ned say to Jon once he arrived? Jon was present in the courtyard on the day House Stark arrived. The king had insisted on a grand welcome. The courtyard was bustling with banners, gold cloaks, and curious onlookers. Jon, standing in a modest cloak of dark gray, watched as Ned Stark entered on horseback, accompanied by a procession of Northmen. Beside Ned rode two young girls, one with auburn hair, Sansa, looking every inch the lady, and a younger one with a wild look in her gray eyes, Arya. Jon recognized them from the descriptions. Also among them were a small boy, Bran, and an even younger one, Rickon, though Rickon was too small to ride alone and was carried by a retainer. The eldest, Robb, had stayed behind in Winterfell to rule in Ned's absence, or so the rumors went. Jon felt his heart hammer. These were his kin. They had no idea who he was, only that he was a bastard in the king's household. Yet standing just behind Ned was a great hulking figure with half his face covered in burned scars. The Hound, Sandor Clegane, presumably assigned to protect the New Hands party. As the king strode forward to greet them, Jon hung back, uncertain if Ned would acknowledge him. But Ned spotted Jon through the throng, and his eyes softened. He inclined his head, a small gesture of recognition, but a significant one to Jon, who quickly returned it, trying to hide the tremor in his chest. That evening, a feast was held in honor of the new hand. The great hall was ablaze with torches, the table groaning under the weight of roasted meats, stewed vegetables, and flagons of wine. Jon found himself seated near the dais, though not at the high table. From his vantage, he could see Ned Stark and King Robert conversing. He watched Sansa and Arya poke each other under the table, saw how the queen cast disapproving glances at their unseemly behavior. Joffrey sat near Sansa, trying to charm her, but Arya made faces. Jon couldn't help but smirk at Arya's boldness. She reminded him of himself at that age, indifferent to courtiers' opinions, openly scornful of vanity. Partway through the feast, Ned requested a private audience with Jon. They withdrew to a small antechamber off the hall, where Ned closed the door. The older man studied Jon in the flickering candlelight, noting how much he'd grown. Jon noticed the lines on Ned's face, deeper than before, and the weariness in his eyes. Ned reached out, resting a hand on Jon's shoulder. "You've grown into a fine young man," he said quietly. "I hear you excel at swordsmanship." Jon felt a tightness in his throat. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but all that came out was a soft, "I'm learning, my lord." Ned's eyes flickered with something: regret, sorrow, pride. "I wish there were things I could tell you, but for now, know that I'm proud of you. Robert watches over you in his own way, but that may not always be enough in this place. If ever you need me, Jon, come to me." Jon nodded, swallowing a surge of emotion. "Thank you, my lord." Ned started to speak again, then hesitated. In the end, he merely squeezed Jon's shoulder and left the room, leaving Jon feeling both reassured and more uncertain than ever. With Ned Stark installed as hand, the dynamic at court shifted dramatically. The small council was abuzz with new tensions, especially when Ned started investigating the circumstances of Jon Arryn's death. Whispers of poison, conspiracies, and bastard lineages floated around. Jon found himself drawn into the periphery of it all. Ned questioned him politely about anything he might have overheard in the Red Keep over the years, any stray mentions of Jon Arryn's inquiries. Jon recalled that the late hand had, indeed, been asking after King Robert's bastards in the city, but it hadn't concerned Jon directly. Apparently, Robert had sired many across the realm, though this was the worst-kept secret in all the Seven Kingdoms. Jon told Ned what little he knew, but it seemed to raise more questions than answers. Cersei, for her part, grew alarmed at the changes Ned was bringing. She reasserted her hold on Joffrey, reminding the boy that he would be king someday, and encouraging him to stand up to Ned whenever he could. This inevitably led to more confrontations in the courtyard, more sneering from Joffrey, more stilted politeness from Ned. Jon found it best to keep his head down, but he found himself sympathizing with Ned's daughters, Sansa, who seemed determined to see only the romantic side of court life, and Arya, who chafed at every rule placed upon her. Arya spotted Jon practicing swordplay one afternoon and marched straight up to him, demanding he show her how to hold her blade properly. She had a small wooden sword that Jon recognized as the gift from her half-brother Robb, or perhaps from her dancing master, Syrio Farrell. Jon hesitated, uncertain if Ned or the king would approve, but Arya's fierce determination reminded him of himself. He walked her through the basics. She beamed at him. "You fight like you mean it," she commented. "The others just prance around." Jon couldn't help but grin. They only sparred for a moment before a steward caught sight of them and ushered Arya away, admonishing her for fraternizing with the Snow Boy. Arya stuck her tongue out at the steward and followed, leaving Jon with a glimmer of amusement in an otherwise tense environment. As the days went on, Ned's investigations began to rattle the Queen's allies. Littlefinger hovered around with his sly smile, offering cryptic advice to both Ned and Jon. Lord Varys appeared more frequently in corridors, cooing about the realm's stability and the need for caution. The tension ratcheted higher when Ned discovered something about Joffrey's parentage, something that made Ned grow pale and grim. Jon only heard fragments, references to seed is strong and black hair, genealogies of House Baratheon. Suddenly, the king's bastards became a central point of interest. It crossed Jon's mind that he, too, was rumored to be one such bastard, albeit from the north rather than from one of Robert's many liaisons. But it was not him that Ned's discovery threatened. It was Joffrey. It was the Queen. The knowledge that Joffrey was not Robert's true son weighed on Ned's conscience like a leaden cloak, and Jon saw the dark worry in the hand's eyes whenever he passed him in the halls. Things came to a head when Robert decided to go on another hunt. The court was abuzz that the king was in an especially foul mood, having argued with Ned about Targaryen threats across the sea. Ned insisted on caution on the well-being of the realm, but Robert roared about smashing his enemies as he had done in the rebellion. The king drank heavily during the hunt, ignoring Ned's attempts at restraint. Jon was not invited this time. Robert said it was a smaller affair, just him, his squires, and a few close companions. So Jon stayed behind, continuing his training and waiting for Robert's return. But what returned was not Robert in full health, but a grievously wounded king, gored by a boar, the same creature he had boasted of defeating so easily in hunts past. The court reeled at the news. Cersei rushed to the king's bedside. Ned came swiftly. Jon lurked on the fringes, sick with worry, remembering the first hunt he had gone on with Robert, how the king's bravado had seemed so unstoppable then. Robert lingered for days in agony, enough time to speak final words, to name Ned Stark as regent for Joffrey. But Ned knew the truth of Joffrey's parentage by then. He wrestled with his honor. Should he proclaim Joffrey a bastard, reveal the queen's treachery, or respect the king's final wishes? Jon heard only snatches of the turmoil, glimpsed Ned pacing through the corridors, wearing a face that betrayed sleepless nights. Cersei was nowhere to be seen in public, presumably plotting behind closed doors with the likes of Littlefinger and Pycelle. Finally, the day came. King Robert breathed his last. Bells tolled. Cersei wasted no time. She declared Joffrey the new king, though the ceremony was hastily arranged. Ned objected, but the gold cloaks turned on him. A swirl of violence erupted in the throne room. Jon was outside when it happened, but he heard the screams, the clash of steel. He rushed in, only to see Ned being seized by Lannister men, Joffrey perched on the Iron Throne, and Cersei looking triumphant. Sansa was weeping, Arya nowhere in sight. Jon felt a surge of panic. King Robert was gone, and all that was left was the Lannisters' grasp on power. In the chaos, no one paid attention to Jon for a moment. He saw the newly anointed King Joffrey smirking down at Ned Stark. Cersei was urging caution, but Joffrey, consumed by the drama of the moment, declared Ned Stark a traitor who had conspired to steal the throne. Jon felt his blood run cold. He knew this was madness, that Ned had only done his duty. He realized, too, that if Ned was labeled a traitor, Jon's own position was precarious indeed. He tried to step forward, to speak, but the Hound blocked him. Behind the Hound, Littlefinger and Varys watched with expressions Jon could not decode. The newly sworn gold cloaks glinted menacingly, loyal to the Lannisters. Jon retreated, fear thrumming in his veins. In the days that followed, Joffrey's reign began in terror. Ned Stark was locked in a dungeon, rumored to be facing execution. Sansa was forced to plead for her father's life. Arya had vanished. The city seethed with tension. Jon felt helpless, unsure what to do. He was a mere bastard in the eyes of the court with no official power. Yet he remembered Ned's words, "If ever you need me, Jon, come to me." Now it was Ned who needed help. Each passing hour, rumors grew wilder. Some said Joffrey intended to behead Ned. Others said he might show mercy. Still others whispered that the Queen had her own plans. The tension weighed so heavily on Jon that he could barely sleep. Finally, one night, he resolved to act. He went to Ser Barristan Selmy, who had been dismissed from the Kingsguard in a shocking show of the new regime's cruelty, replaced by the more pliable Jaime Lannister as Lord Commander. Ser Barristan listened quietly to Jon's pleas for help. The old knight looked haunted, distraught at the state of affairs in King's Landing. "I have sworn my vows," he said softly, "but the boy king has cast me aside. I cannot claim to serve him, nor can I stand by while an honorable man dies." Jon saw in Ser Barristan's eyes a flicker of decision. "What would you do?" asked the old knight. Jon swallowed. "I would save Lord Eddard if I can. I owe him everything." Ser Barristan closed his eyes, and when he opened them, the quiet sorrow was replaced by steel. "Then we must find a way." That very night, chaos struck the Red Keep. Word spread that Joffrey planned to hold a public display. Ned Stark's confession, followed by either mercy or punishment. Sansa's desperate pleas had led her to believe her father might be spared. Jon and Ser Barristan, on the other hand, heard rumors that the outcome was decided, and it would be no mercy. As dawn broke, a crowd gathered at the Great September of Baelor. Jon forced his way through the throngs, cloak pulled up to hide his features. He saw Ned Stark being dragged out onto the steps, gaunt from his time in the dungeon. Sansa stood nearby, pale with fear, while Joffrey towered above on a raised platform, flanked by the Hound, the Gold Cloaks, and the Queen. Grand Maester Pycelle droned on, and Ned was forced to speak. He confessed to treason, or so it seemed. Jon realized it was a lie forced from Ned's lips to spare Sansa and Arya. Then Joffrey, with cruel glee, announced that the punishment for treason was death. Cersei's eyes widened in alarm. She had evidently not expected Joffrey to go so far, so openly. Sansa screamed. Ned closed his eyes. In that moment, the crowd erupted. Ser Barristan, who had been hiding nearby, stepped forward, bellowing for Ned Stark's release. A handful of men loyal to the old knight charged the Gold Cloaks. Jon, seized by desperation, rushed forward too, pushing through the onlookers. Steel flashed. Joffrey shrieked for the Hound to protect him. Ned Stark, still on his knees, was caught in the middle. The crowd surged, a wave of bodies. Swords clashed. Arrows whizzed overhead. In the confusion, Ser Barristan managed to cut down the gold cloak nearest Ned. Jon scrambled forward, helping Ned to his feet, ignoring the sting of a sword grazing his shoulder. Sansa was sobbing, clinging to her father. Cersei barked orders. The Gold Cloaks regrouped, but the crowd's panic made it difficult for them to get close. Barristan and his men managed to bundle Ned, Sansa, and Jon into a wagon, while the rest tried to hold off the Lannister soldiers. As the wagon lurched forward, Jon glimpsed Joffrey's face, twisted with rage. Arrows flew after them. Some found targets among the fleeing men. Barristan cursed as one of the horses took a wound. But the wagon barreled forward, eventually reaching a side street. City watchmen followed, but by luck or cunning, the group evaded them in the Warren of King's Landing's backstreets. By nightfall, they were secreted away in an old stable near the city's edge. Ned was weak, Sansa trembling, and Ser Barristan severely outnumbered. Jon sat in a corner, trying to stanch the bleeding from his shoulder. He realized, with a pounding heart, that they had just committed open treason against the new king. There would be no going back now. Ned looked at Jon with weary gratitude. "Why?" he asked softly. "You risked your life." Jon shook his head. "You're the only man who ever cared for me, my lord," he replied, voice tight. "I wouldn't stand by and watch you die." Ned closed his eyes. A pained smile flickered across his face. "Your mother would be proud," he murmured, words that puzzled Jon. But there was no time for explanation. Sansa was sobbing for Arya, for the rest of her family. Ned tried to comfort her, though he could barely stand. Ser Barristan paced, eyes darting at the stable doors. He said they had to leave the city before dawn, or the Lannisters would swarm them. Ned wanted to take Sansa and go north, but Barristan pointed out that the city gates would be heavily guarded. They needed a plan, a distraction, or a boat to sail for Dragonstone or the Vale, anywhere but King's Landing. Jon realized the peril they faced was enormous. Meanwhile, chaos reigned in the city itself. Word of Ned Stark's dramatic rescue spread, fueling both outrage and excitement. The gold cloaks combed the streets, looking for any sign of the escapees. The Queen was rumored to be furious. Joffrey's madness was on full display, ordering entire neighborhoods searched, demanding heads. The tension that had simmered now boiled over into riots, with small folk angry at the heavy-handed crackdown. Fires broke out in Flea Bottom, while the Red Keep locked its gates and prepared for a siege of sorts. Jon, in the stable, felt the city's unrest like a heartbeat beneath the floor. Each shout or scream in the distance made Sansa tremble. Ned tried to form a plan, but the blow to his leg that he'd taken during the scuffle hampered his thoughts. Finally, Barristan insisted they needed outside help. Someone with a boat, someone who could secure them safe passage out. "I know a smuggler who once served Lord Stannis," Barristan said grimly. "If he's still around, we may be able to buy his help." Ned agreed. Leaving Sansa with 2 trusted men, Barristan and Jon slipped into the night to find the smuggler. Jon walked the streets in dark clothes, trying to avoid the roving patrols. Fires glowed in the distance. Men shouted. Barristan led him along back alleys. An old cowl pulled over his white hair. They eventually found the smuggler in a disreputable dockside tavern, a man with missing fingertips named Davos Seaworth. He listened to their plea, recognized Ser Barristan, and after a long silence, nodded. "I owe my life to Stannis Baratheon," he said quietly. "But with Robert dead and Joffrey on the throne, the realm is undone. I'll help you, Ser, but I'll need coin to grease the right palms." Barristan handed over a small pouch of gold that Ned had stashed for emergencies. Davos tested the coins between his teeth, then met Jon's eye. "We sail tonight." With that settled, they returned to gather Ned and Sansa. By the time dawn was nearing, Ned, Sansa, Jon, and Barristan were hidden below decks on a small, nondescript vessel owned by Davos Seaworth. The sails were furled, the oars in place. Davos's sons helped row quietly out of the harbor, past the patrolling warships. The darkness and the chaotic state of the city worked to their advantage. Once out on open water, the group let out a collective breath. Ned slumped against a crate, Sansa curled next to him. Jon stood on deck, feeling the salt wind whip his hair, uncertain of what the future held. He gazed back at King's Landing, its skyline lit by dawn's first light, the Red Keep looming on its hill like a wounded beast. Everything he had known, his entire childhood, was contained in those walls. And he had fled it, branded a traitor, forever exiled unless some miracle reversed Joffrey's decree. A swirl of emotions battered him. Fear, relief, excitement, sorrow. Yet one thought rose above all the rest. Ned was alive. And for now, that was enough. As Davos guided the ship north along the coast, the travelers formed a plan. Barristan told them that the Vale might be safer, with Lisa Arryn ruling in her late husband's stead. But Ned shook his head. My sister-by-law is not always rational. We need to reach the north to rally my bannermen. Perhaps from there, we can call the banners and restore peace to the realm. Barristan sighed. Then you'd be openly defying Joffrey's claim. Ned's jaw tightened. He's no rightful king, he said quietly, shooting a glance at Sansa to remind her not to speak of it openly. He's the product of incest between the queen and her brother. I have proof. Jon listened, heart pounding, as Ned briefly outlined the truth he had uncovered. Incest. Joffrey not Robert's true son. It was a monstrous claim that would upend the realm if widely believed. Jon suddenly understood why Ned had hesitated to reveal it. This was the sort of truth men killed for. And Robert had died not knowing or perhaps suspecting. The memory of Robert's last days stabbed at Jon's heart. He turned away, letting the wind sting his eyes. All of them realized that war was likely brewing. Tywin Lannister would not allow House Stark to remain unpunished for this slight. And with Joffrey wearing the crown, the Lannisters effectively controlled the throne. The realm was about to split, with the Riverlands, the North, and possibly the Vale opposing the Iron Throne, and the Reach and Westerlands likely to side with the Lannisters. Dark times loomed. Jon's place in this conflict was uncertain. He was no one in the eyes of the great lords, just a bastard boy who grew up in the Red Keep. But his loyalties were clear. Ned was the only father figure who had ever shown him consistent kindness, and King Robert was gone, replaced by a twisted doppelganger on the throne. Jon vowed to fight for Ned if it came to that. He said as much to the man himself. Ned nodded solemnly, placing a hand on Jon's shoulder. You have the Stark look, he said. But more importantly, you have the Stark heart. Jon's eyes stung. He wanted to ask the question he'd always feared to ask. Was Ned truly his father? But a mixture of dread and respect kept him silent. Now was not the time. The voyage took several days, hugging the coast, avoiding major ports. Davos used his smugglers' routes to slip them past patrols. Along the way, they caught glimpses of a realm in turmoil. Burning villages, refugees fleeing on muddy roads, rumors of skirmishes between Lannister and Tully forces. Eventually, they made landfall near White Harbor, the largest northern port. There, the Manderleys, loyal bannermen of the Starks, received them with astonished relief. Lord Wyman Manderley himself hurried to greet Ned, promising the full support of White Harbor's knights and soldiers. Ned, still limping from his injuries, managed a smile of gratitude. Sansa clung to his arm, grateful to be on solid ground among allies. Barristan stood at a polite distance, uncertain of his status in the north. Jon felt a thrill of unfamiliar recognition. Here, among these men, he was not the king's mongrel, but the ward who had saved Lord Stark. That story was already spreading, whispered by Manderley's men. Jon felt the warmth of belonging, even if it was tenuous. He thought of the Red Keep's corridors, the hush of distrust that had followed him everywhere. Here, men seemed proud of him, or at least respectful. Ned wasted no time. He sent ravens to Winterfell, to the lords of the north, informing them of the grave situation in King's Landing and Robert's death. He called upon them to gather at Winterfell to decide their course. War loomed, for the Lannisters would not relent, and Ned was determined not to let the North bow to a false king. Sansa remained in White Harbor, safe behind its walls, while Ned, Barristan, and Jon pressed on to Winterfell by horseback. Jon gazed in awe at the snow-dusted landscape, the tall pines, the crisp northern air that tingled his lungs. This was the land of his ancestors, a land he had only known through half-remembered stories from childhood. Now he saw it with his own eyes, and a strange resonance stirred in him, as though a part of him recognized home. When they finally rode through the gates of Winterfell, Jon's heart hammered in his chest. The ancient keep rose before them, its great gray walls blending into the wintry skies. Ned inhaled sharply, clearly relieved to be home. Robb Stark came rushing out, flanked by Theon Greyjoy and a host of Stark men. Robb embraced his father, relief and worry etched on his features. Then he looked at Jon with curiosity. Jon inclined his head, uncertain how to greet a brother he'd never truly met. "Robb," Ned said gently, "this is Jon. He's been living in King's Landing under the late King's guardianship." Robb nodded slowly, searching Jon's face. "You're the same age as me," Robb observed, a note of wonder in his voice. Jon nodded. Robb extended a hand. "Welcome home. Father's told me about you. A bit." Jon shook his hand, feeling a lump in his throat. There was no condemnation in Robb's gaze, only a kind of wary acceptance. Within the hour, Bran, still recuperating from a fall that Ned's letters had only briefly mentioned, was carried out to meet his father. Rickon clung shyly to Ned's leg. Jon watched them all, feeling a pang of loss for the years he'd missed. Arya, the family said, was still missing in King's Landing, but Ned held out hope she had escaped. Sorrow weighed on them, but they clung to the relief of being reunited at least in part. That night, a feast was hastily prepared, not the grandest due to the times, but enough to welcome Ned home and acknowledge Ser Barristan's presence. The great hall of Winterfell felt warm with hearth fires, but the mood was tense with war looming. Lords began arriving in the days that followed, sworn to House Stark, prepared to mobilize if Ned called the banners. A great council formed in Winterfell's hall, with Ned at the head, Robb at his right, and Jon standing near, silent but watchful. Ser Barristan was also there, an odd sight among the northern lords. They discussed strategy, alliances, possible moves against the Lannisters. Word had come that Tywin Lannister was marching on the Riverlands, that Edmure Tully was under siege at Riverrun. Ned insisted they must relieve their Tully kin. Robb bristled with young fervor, eager to prove himself. The Northmen agreed to march, though some voiced concerns about the southern ambitions. Jon observed it all, torn. He felt loyalty to Ned, loyalty to this new home that was his by blood if not by name. But he also felt the old pang for Robert, the king who had raised him in a haphazard way. Robert was gone, yet the memory of his boisterous laughter haunted Jon's dreams. Now it was war. War against the boy who wore the Iron Throne, the boy who had tormented Jon for so long. War against Cersei, who had seethed at Jon's presence, who had orchestrated or at least aided in Ned's downfall. Perhaps war was inevitable. Jon sought out Ned after the council. "I want to fight for you," he said quietly. Ned's expression was pained. "You're still young, Jon. I've seen too much war to wish it on any lad, especially one who deserves better." Jon set his jaw. "I've trained every day of my life with a sword. Let me serve. I'm no lord, no knight, but I can fight." Ned studied him, a fatherly sorrow in his eyes. Finally, he nodded, placing a hand on Jon's shoulder. "We'll need every sword," he admitted. "But promise me this. If the chance comes, seek peace before bloodshed. We've lost too much already." Jon promised, though he knew that once swords were drawn, peace would be hard to come by. They marched south soon after. Thousands of Northmen, clad in thick furs and heavy steel, banners emblazoned with direwolves flapping in the breeze. Ned's banner was at the forefront, Robb by his side, Theon Greyjoy leading a contingent of archers, and Jon among a group of squires and lesser knights. Ser Barristan rode nearby, continuing to show respect for House Stark, though some Northmen eyed him warily as a former Kingsguard. The journey was arduous, crossing the neck through the treacherous bogs, passing Moat Caelan's ancient towers. All the while, ravens brought news. The Lannisters were laying waste to villages in the Riverlands. Jaime Lannister had captured Edmure Tully. Tywin was massing a huge army. The North rushed to the aid of their Tully allies, each day's delay costly. Throughout it all, Jon tried to find moments of quiet to reflect. He sometimes gazed at the star-filled sky, remembering how different the city lights had been in King's Landing. Here, the darkness was thick and absolute, the only illumination coming from stars and the moon. He felt closer to something primal, some ancient bond that the Starks shared with their land. He felt it in the wind, in the rustle of leaves, in the distant howl of wolves. It comforted him even as war loomed. He found himself thinking of Arya, hoping she was alive and safe. He recalled Sansa's tears and her longing for a fairy tale court. He wondered if the realm would ever see peace again. The old stories he had read in the Red Keep's library seemed so far away. Now he was part of a living history, one that might end in bloodshed. When the host reached the Riverlands, war erupted in earnest. Skirmishes flared between Stark outriders and Lannister scouts. Fields burned, small folk fled. Ned divided his forces, sending Robb and half the host to engage Jaime Lannister near the Whispering Wood while Ned led the rest to relieve Riverrun directly. Jon found himself at Ned's side, though he had no illusions about his own importance. He was just another young fighter in the throng. But as the armies clashed, he saw the brutality of war firsthand. The clang of steel, the screams of wounded men and horses, the stench of blood. He fought when he had to, parrying blows and using the techniques drilled into him by the Master-at-Arms in King's Landing. More than once, his life was saved by the timely intervention of a fellow Stark soldier or Ser Barristan. By battle's end, the Lannister forces had fallen back, and Ned's men cheered. But the cost was high. Hundreds of Northmen lay dead or dying, and Ned himself was wounded anew. The war had only begun. Still, Riverrun was freed, and Catelyn Stark emerged to embrace her husband, her eyes filled with tears of relief and sorrow. She looked upon Jon with a mixture of gratitude and unease. She had never expected to see the supposed bastard in her home, fighting under Stark banners. Yet she said nothing, for the war overshadowed old grudges. The Tullys welcomed the Starks, forging a united front against the Lannisters. Robb returned triumphantly, having captured Jaime Lannister in a nighttime ambush. The Northmen hailed Robb as the young wolf, a cunning commander. Ned quietly praised his son's success, though he worried about the realm's fate. Jon watched the Stark family reunite, feeling a quiet sense of belonging mixed with a lingering sense of being an outsider. But perhaps that was his lot in life, a foot in both worlds, never fully belonging to either. In the days that followed, the great lords of the North and Riverlands gathered to discuss the future. They were outraged at the boy king on the Iron Throne, outraged at the Lannisters' brutality. Some whispered that Ned Stark should take the throne himself, or at least declare independence for the North. Others pressed for Renly or Stannis Baratheon, claiming one or the other had a stronger claim now that Joffrey's parentage was in doubt. Ned listened wearily to the arguments. He was a soldier at heart, not a politician. In private, he told Jon that all he truly wanted was justice for Robert, and peace for the realm. But peace may be beyond our grasp, Ned mused sadly. With Robert gone, the realm stands on a knife's edge. Word spread that Stannis was raising a fleet at Dragonstone, preparing to challenge Joffrey's claim. Renly had fled south, courting the support of the Tyrells. War had many fronts, and the dream of a united Westeros seemed distant. Ned's sense of duty told him to support the rightful Baratheon heir, Stannis. But many northern lords resented Stannis' stern nature and had never held him in high regard. Still, the truth about Joffrey being no true Baratheon made supporting him unthinkable. So Ned sent envoys to Stannis, proposing an alliance in Robert's memory. Meanwhile, the North and the Riverlands braced for the Lannister counterattack. Jaime was a valuable hostage, yet Tywin Lannister still commanded a fearsome host and the coffers of Casterly Rock. In all these discussions, Jon stood at Ned's side, quiet but observant, noticing how the words and alliances shifted like quicksand. He recalled the political intrigues of King's Landing, how men like Littlefinger and Varys thrived in them. Out here on the battlefield, intrigue took a different form. negotiations over hostages, strategic marriages, or supply lines. Jon listened, storing away knowledge. He also took every spare moment to practice with his sword, to stand guard if needed, to care for Ned when his wounds pained him. He had chosen his side, and he would see it through. As the night fires lit up the camp, sometimes Jon would sit by the river, gazing at the moonlight on the water. He would think of all he had left behind. The red keeps echoing halls, the courtyard where he trained, King Robert's sometimes affectionate, sometimes distant presence. He thought of Joffrey's sneer, the Queen's cold disdain. He thought of Myrcella's gentle kindness, Tommen's shy wave. He wondered what would become of them in this war. He found himself missing aspects of that life, even though it had been fraught with tension and doubt. It was, after all, the only life he had known until now. But everything had changed the day Ned was arrested. Now Jon belonged to the North, and he was beginning to realize that perhaps he always had. One crisp morning, as Ned conferred with his captains, Jon ventured outside Riverrun's walls. He walked among the camp followers and the war tents, seeking a moment of solitude. There, by the water's edge, he saw Barristan Selmy, seated on a rock. The old knight turned as Jon approached and offered a faint smile. "It's quiet here compared to King's Landing," Barristan observed. "Yes," Jon replied, seating himself on another rock. He paused, then asked, "Do you regret leaving the Kingsguard?" Barristan exhaled. "A knight's vows are his life. I served the realm through King Aerys's madness and Robert's rebellion. I thought I could serve Robert's son. But Joffrey is no son of Robert. And the realm needs honorable men, not butchers." Jon nodded, staring at the river. After a moment, he ventured, "Do you think we can win?" Barristan was silent for a time, the water lapping at the shore. "If the North stands firm, if Stannis unites the Stormlands, if the lords of Westeros choose justice over fear, perhaps. But the wheel turns, lad. The wheel always turns, crushing those beneath it." Jon considered that grim assessment, yet he felt a stirring of resolve inside him. He had escaped King's Landing, saved Ned's life, joined the Starks in their cause. However the wheel might turn, he would not stand idly by. He might be just a bastard, but he would do what was right or die trying. Over the following weeks, ravens brought word of new developments. Stannis had declared himself king, claiming that Joffrey was a product of incest, though the crown's official line was that Stannis was a usurper. Renly had also declared himself king, forging an alliance with the Reach. The War of the Five Kings, men were calling it. In this swirl of chaos, Ned Stark conferred with his bannermen in Riverrun's war room. Robb argued for a swift strike at Harrenhal, where Tywin was said to be camped, but Ned cautioned that Tywin might be luring them into a trap. Meanwhile, Walder Frey's loyalties remained uncertain, and the twins were a key crossing. Every decision carried risk. Jon stood by, absorbing the gravity of it. Lives hung in the balance. The entire realm was fracturing. In quieter moments, Ned spoke to Jon about the future, about how, should the war go well, he intended to settle matters with the crown. "We must place the rightful Baratheon on the throne. That would be Stannis by law," Ned said. "But I fear he may not be the king the realm needs. Still, the law is the law." He paused, studying Jon. "When the war ends, if it ends in our favor, you must decide your path, Jon. You can remain with us in the North, or perhaps there is another path for you." Jon felt a flicker of confusion. "What other path?" Ned lowered his voice. "The Night's Watch is always an option, if you wish to follow in your Uncle Benjen's footsteps." Jon startled. He had heard of the Watch, the Black Brothers guarding the wall, but he had never considered joining them. "But I've only just found a place here," he protested. Ned's expression was pained. "I know, but the Watch is a refuge for bastards, second sons, men who seek a purpose. Consider it. The war will change many things, and I cannot guarantee will prevail. But the Watch stands, whatever happens." Jon considered the notion. Part of him recoiled from it. He had known little enough of family, and now that he'd tasted it, was he to surrender it for the black cloak of the Watch? But another part of him understood Ned's logic. If the war took a dark turn, the North might suffer greatly. The Watch could be a refuge from the realm's politics. Jon sighed, uncertain. "I'll think on it," he said. Ned nodded solemnly. Time passed and the war pressed on. Skirmishes flared across the riverlands. Scouts reported movements of Tywin's army, scattered uprisings of bandits, and rumors that the mountain was harrying the local populace. News from King's Landing was scarce, but one day a battered raven arrived, bearing an official missive. Joffrey had declared Eddard Stark, Barristan Selmy, and Jon Snow as traitors, sentencing them to death in absentia. The missive named Jon as the false bastard who conspired with the rebellious North to undermine the rightful crown. Jon read the words with a scoff of disbelief. So that was how the history books would record him if the Lannisters won. A pang stabbed his chest as he thought of the Red Keep that had once been his home. Now he was an outlaw in the eyes of the boy who sat the throne. The illusions of belonging to that life were gone. Yet for all the war's tragedy, Jon sometimes caught moments of camaraderie in the camp. He sparred with Robb, who was a skilled swordsman with a direwolf named Grey Wind prowling nearby. The men would cheer them on, a rare bit of levity amid the gloom. Robb always teased Jon about his King's Landing style, which relied on quick reflexes and cunning footwork, whereas the Northmen favored brute strength and endurance. Each session ended in good-natured laughter, though Jon sensed an undercurrent of competition. They were nearly the same age, both recognized as strong fighters, but Robb was a trueborn heir to Winterfell, while Jon was the King's Landing stray. Still, a bond formed between them, born of shared risk and the simple fact that they were, in some way, kin. At night, the wolves howled in the distance, and Jon dreamt of wandering the Red Keep's corridors again, searching for something he could never find. He would wake, heart pounding, to the sound of the northern wind outside his tent. Each dawn, he rose and continued his duties, uncertain where fate would take him, but certain that he would not abandon Ned Stark. He was Robert's ward, raised in the south, but his blood was Stark, and as war consumed Westeros, that simple truth would define the rest of his life, for good or ill. And so the boy who grew up in King's Landing under Robert's guardianship marched onward, a sword at his side, a secret in his blood, and a relentless determination in his heart. He had left the Red Keep behind, but he carried its lessons within him. The knowledge that power can be fickle, that loyalties can shift like sand, and that sometimes a single life can alter the course of a realm. Whether that life was named Snow or Stark or Targaryen mattered less than the choices one made when the swords were drawn and the ravens flew. And as the rivers ran red with war and the wolves howled in the night, Jon made his choice. He would stand with Ned Stark no matter the cost.